Hey friend, I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, do me a tiny favor, tap that like button, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. I also love hearing from you, so take a second and leave a comment. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Somewhere in between? Let me know down below. Now, let's settle in. Slow breath. Long exhale. And let's begin. Because tonight, we're going back in time, not just to ancient Egypt, but deep inside the scented, silken chambers of Cleopatra herself. She's been painted in myths, wrapped in mystery, and whispered about in every generation since she reigned. But for all the opulence and allure, the beauty that Cleopatra became legendary for was not only strange by modern standards, but often downright revolting. Her secrets didn't come in the form of shimmering elixirs or golden potions poured delicately from crystal vials. They came from rot, from fermentation, from the bodies of animals, and the decay of things left to fester. And yet, they worked. At least in the context of her world. Her face, they said, could bend empires. Her voice alone had a sweetness that softened the heart of Julius Caesar. But the glow of her skin, the scent on her wrists, the color of her cheeks, those came from rituals that might just turn your stomach. So breathe in gently. We'll walk slowly. You don't need to see her as a goddess. Not tonight. Just a woman, a ruler, a manipulator of appearances, a queen who weaponized her body like a blade. Let's begin where her day might have begun, in the bathhouse. Except this wasn't warm lavender-scented water or a candlelit soak. Cleopatra's signature bath was in fermented donkey milk. To achieve the effect she desired, it said she needed hundreds of donkeys. The milk would be drawn fresh and left to sour slightly, fermenting just enough to thicken. She'd step into the tub not when it was fresh and white, but when the air had turned slightly acrid and the scent curled at the nostrils. Because she believed, and many in her time agreed, that the slight sting of spoiled milk softened the skin, erased blemishes, and made her appear younger. Imagine sinking into that pale, sour pool as servants fanned you and incense burned to mask the rot. That was beauty. That was power. And it was just the beginning. Her body was then anointed with oils, not always floral or fresh. Some were made by macerating animal fats mixed with lead-based pigments, or by steeping herbs in spoiled lard. These would be rubbed into her skin to seal in the softness. Her attendants worked in silence, scraping away dry skin with pumice stones made from volcanic glass, their hands trained to glide across her form without flaw. Her hair? Thick, dark, and gleaming, but not with modern conditioner. It's believed Cleopatra used a blend of crushed beetles, burned date pits, and lard to color and shine her hair. And that mixture, while effective in the dim candlelight of the palace, would have smelled deeply earthy, with notes of ash, animal, and sweet decay. She wore wigs sometimes too, intricately braided ones made of human hair and sometimes animal hair, scented not with perfumes but sometimes with resins, animal musk, and oils drawn from plants steeped in wine or vinegar. And her makeup was legendary. The kohl eyeliner that extended in elegant black wings beyond her lids was not mere charcoal. It often contained lead sulfide, which could eat away at skin over time and cause damage with long-term use. But it gave her eyes their power. The dark lines made her gaze hypnotic, and the green eyeshadow, often made from malachite, a crushed copper ore, toxic if inhaled or ingested, but vivid under torchlight. Her cheeks? Flushed with red pigment made from rust, literally iron oxide, or sometimes crushed insects like cochineal. Her lips might be stained with carmine or mixtures containing animal blood, mixed with wax and a hint of honey. Sweet, seductive, and potentially full of pathogens. Her perfume was strong, almost overwhelming. She didn't believe in subtlety. She wanted to arrive in a room before her footsteps. One famous blend she wore was called Mendesianate, was made with myrrh, cinnamon, and other resins boiled in fat, then aged until it thickened. The scent was said to cling to her skin for days. Some records suggest she experimented with scents that included civet or ambergris, both derived from animal secretions. Think less floral breeze, more musky, animalistic heaviness that lingered like a presence. And still it worked. She was adored, envied, feared. Her allure was more than the sum of its parts. Her rituals, though strange and at times grotesque, created an aura that extended beyond her body. She was a woman who knew the power of illusion. She knew that scent, color, and skin were as much armor as any soldier's shield. She turned filth into fascination. She transformed decay into divinity. Even the creams she applied to her face overnight were far from modern hydration masks. Some were made of powdered crocodile dung mixed with honey and milk. Others included crushed pearl if she was feeling extravagant. The dung, they believed, cured wrinkles. The pearl? Prestige. A symbol. And what of her teeth? White, smooth, without the benefit of modern paste or brush. She may have used powdered hooves or ash mixed with mint, scraped over with a frayed reed or cloth. A little blood, a little pain normal for the day. Her breath? Freshened with myrrh, gum, or chewing sticks soaked in sweet wine. The dirt didn't disappear. It was simply overpowered, hidden, outshone, and that was Cleopatra's genius. Her world didn't smell like a flower shop. It smelled like life animal, earth, rot, renewal, and she turned that into mystique. So when you think of beauty today, of cleansers and serums and fragrances, remember this. It's not about clean, it's about control. She controlled the narrative of her own body, her presence, her mythology. Her secrets were disgusting, and that's what made them work. She did not walk through her palace as a woman who merely inherited power. She moved like someone who created it. With each step echoing across polished alabaster floors, Cleopatra's presence extended beyond her silhouette. It was stitched into the walls, baked into the sunlight that filtered through latticework, soaked into the very cushions where senators once knelt. But behind every calculated glance and honeyed word, there was preparation rituals beyond the baths and the scents. In her chamber, secret drawers hid scrolls, not only of statecraft or alliances, but of recipes, potions, mixtures, prescriptions of beauty layered with the grotesque. These were handwritten by court alchemists and physicians, some believed to be more sorcerers than scientists. And within these recipes were ingredients that defied even the boundaries of her own empire. One such preparation was a nightly face mask Cleopatra favored in her later years. It contained powdered white lead, ground finely until it became almost luminous in candlelight. Mixed with vinegar and occasionally fig sap, it was brushed onto her face with a soft reed, like a painter sweeping moonlight across parchment. When it dried, it cracked, it flaked, but it left the skin pale, smooth, seemingly untouched by time. It was poisonous, and she knew. But to her, beauty was worth the risk. Time was the true enemy, and appearance was power's last defense. The hands that applied it were not always hers. She had attendants trained not only in massage or makeup, but in maintaining silence. Their eyes never met hers unless called. They spoke only in response. They understood that touching the queen was like touching sacred stone aloud, but never familiar. They, too, had their rituals. Before each service, they washed their hands in lemon and salt water, believed to purify. They wore linen robes bleached in donkey urania practice thought to sanitize, not offend. Their fingernails were cleaned with sharp fish bones. They approached her not with affection, but reverence. Beneath her bed, bowls of dried herbs and ash lined the stone floor. Some were aromatic lavender, myrrh, frankincense. Others were apotropaic, meant to ward off decay, spirits, age itself. Overhead, thin veils of dyed silk moved with the wind, perfumed to mask any lingering scent of the night's remedies. And yet the smell of Cleopatra's quarters was never truly fresh. It was thick. A blend of incense, human effort, damp linen, ancient oils, and something deeper like forgotten flowers left too long in water. Her wardrobe, too, played a role in the performance of beauty. Though often imagined in gold and dazzling gems, she sometimes wore robes soaked in vinegar and copper salts. These fabrics shimmered under firelight but left a subtle sting on the skin. It was intentional. Pain, she believed, brought awareness. A reminder that the body was present, powerful, alive. Jewelry wasn't always mere decoration. Certain amulets she wore were filled with crushed herbs, and even small insect beetles or ants steeped in wine, then dried. These were believed to preserve fertility, increase desire, or ward off envy. Some of her rings had removable tops containing small reservoirs for perfume or even powdered toxins. She could anoint herself or another with a flick of the wrist. Each item was dual purpose: beauty and defense. Her sandals were lined not with silk, but often with papyrus reeds soaked in resin and herbs. When she walked, her feet pressed against the scent, releasing it subtly. It was said that long after Cleopatra had passed, her sandals still carried the memory of her presence. One peculiar habit involved bees, not living ones, but their byproducts. Cleopatra used bee venom in minute quantities, mixed with water and dabbed gently on her lips or cheeks to induce swelling. This gave the illness ion of vitality, a flush of health, a trick of nature, and like many of her methods, it danced dangerously close to harm. Venom, even diluted, could cause burning, rash, or worse. But it made her appear youthful, vibrant, unforgettable. She accepted the consequences in exchange for control. Another tale speaks of her fascination with menstruation, not her own, necessarily, but the belief that menstrual blood held power. Some believed Cleopatra kept cloths infused with it in hidden pouches sewn into her garments, thinking it granted strength, fertility, or magical protection. Others claim it was used in face treatments. Whether these are myths or truths matters less than the consistency of their theme. Her beauty came from the raw, the taboo, the terrifying. She wasn't afraid of disgust. She used it, manipulated it. In public, her appearance never betrayed the origins of her rituals. Her skin glowed under the Egyptian sun. Her nails were stained with henna, but traced with gold. Her eyebrows were shaped not with tweezers, but by burning individual hairs with tightly coiled string. Painful, yes, but it left a smoother finish, and the scent of singed hair was always covered with crushed mint. Even her voice was altered. Cleopatra was known for its melody, the way her speech entranced others. It's believed she drank mixtures of honey, boiled rose petals, and cinnamon bark to soothe and sweeten her throat. Her breath, warmed by spiced wine or cloves, lingered like a song. Her body was a temple, yes, but not one of clean stone. It was alive with ritual, shadow, and rot. The illusion she presented was immaculate, but the process was dirty, sacred filth. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring secret. Not that she was beautiful, but that she made others believe they understood what beauty was. She changed the rules, rewrote the definitions. She made rot regal, made disgust desirable. In her world, and in ours, that power still echoes. And as the candlelight dims in her chamber and the sounds of servants fade into the distance, what remains is not just the scent of perfume or the shimmer of makeup. It is the weight of intent, the knowledge that every gesture, every practice, no matter how strange, was chosen. And in that choosing, Cleopatra remained sovereign not just of Egypt, but of perception itself. She was not alone in her pursuit of transformation through the grotesque. In her private apothecary, rows of alabaster jars lined the walls, each labeled in faint demotic script, some worn down by time, others darkened by the contents they once held. Inside were the remains of earth and animal, fluid and fungus, mud from the Nile, rich with silt and worm castings, dried crocodile dung powdered and sifted, crushed oyster shells, their edges sharp, mixed with oil to form abrasive scrubs. She had once ordered the import of rare fish from the Red Sea scales stripped and steeped in vinegar to extract the shimmering essence. That essence was added to a body wash, used only on days when Roman dignitaries were expected, not for cleanliness, but for iridescence. The shimmer that caught the torchlight made her seem otherworldly, touched by divinity. One scroll described a ritual in which Cleopatra bathed in the milk of camels, not asses as legends often claim. These camels were fed a diet of honeyed dates and herbs for weeks before their milk was drawn. The resulting bath was said to soften the skin, yes, but also to imbue it with the scent of sun-dried fruit and spice. It was not a bath of comfort. It was tepid, heavy, slick. The milk congealed quickly, curdling in the heat, and attendants were instructed to strain the bathwater mid-ritual. But Cleopatra never flinched. Her eyes remained closed. She floated, unmoving, her body a vessel of stillness and power. What others found repulsive, she accepted as necessity. At times, her rituals involved the participation of animals. Leeches placed behind the ears to stimulate blood flow and brighten the face. Lizards dried and crushed into a powder that, when mixed with water, was dabbed behind the knees and wrists to stimulate warmth and supposed fertility. Even mice played a role. In one scroll fragment, there's mention of a concoction called Daughters of the Moon, composed of boiled mouse flesh, frankincense, myrrh, and figs. The paste was spread on the stomach to ease cramping and possibly enhance the curvature of the lower belly. These were not treatments taught in temples. These were born of whispers, foreign healers, midwives, and women from marketplaces who carried knowledge deeper than physicians. Her fascination with transformation extended beyond the body. Cleopatra employed its scent as a weapon. Her personal perfumer, an aging man from Cyprus named Thalos, worked daily to craft blends that would confuse memory. He layered oils in combinations that had no immediate association. Fennel and blackcurrant, ambergris, and olive wood, henna with orange blossom and smoke, tea. The result was a fragrance that could not be traced. When someone met Cleopatra, they left with a scent that lived in dreams but couldn't be named. That disorientation was intentional. One legend tells of a mirror in her chambers, not of glass but polished obsidian. It did not show her features in daylight, but revealed them by torchlight alone. The flames altered the reflection, made her eyes larger, her skin smoother, her presence darker and more luminous. She would stare into this mirror for hours, not in vanity, but in study, trying to understand how others might see her, trying to mold her presence not just in reality, but in perception. For Cleopatra, beauty was never the goal, influence was. Even in sleep, her appearance was not abandoned. Her bed was lined with linen soaked in rosewater and occasionally laid over a thin dusting of crushed pearl. When she awoke, her skin shimmered faintly, as if dusted by moonlight. Her hair was wrapped in strips of papyrus dipped in vinegar, forming soft coils by morning. And when she rose, the first thing she drank was not wine or water, but a tincture of mint, lotus, and ash. It was bitter, but she believed it cleared the voice and steadied the breath. In moments of intimacy, Cleopatra was said to wear body paint, not for theatricality but for meaning. Her lovers would find symbols drawn along her back, her hips, her thighs. Symbols traced in gold leaf mixed with wax, or in red ochre blended with honey. Each mark had purpose, a phrase, a protection, a command. Some said these markings came from temple rites. Others whispered they were of her own invention, but they all agreed they were never random. She carried herself like scripture, and when the paint smeared, when it melted under touch or breath or heat, it was not destruction, it was activation. In her final years, as Roman shadows grew longer, Cleopatra's rituals did not simplify. They became more intense, more secretive. She began experimenting with minerals from the Siwa oasis crystals ground into fine dust, dissolved in rainwater collected from her palace roof during storms. These mixtures were used in eye baths, facial compresses, and even drops placed on the tongue. Dangerous, yes, but to her, necessary. She believed she could see clearer, speak more persuasively, feel with more precision. Her beauty was no longer about seduction, it was defense. Armor. The closer danger crept, the more meticulously she prepared. Her last documented preparation involved a stone bath lined with gold leaf. Into it were poured donkey milk, honey, wine, and ash. Not to cleanse, but to preserve. She lay in it for hours before meeting Octavian's envoys. Her attendants were ordered to keep the room dark, the air cool, and no scent allowed save for rosewood smoke. When she emerged, she looked not radiant, but immortal. And that, in the end, was the point. For centuries, people have tried to decipher Cleopatra's beauty. Some say it was exaggerated. Others claim it was ordinary. But none can deny that the legacy of her appearancer effect is real. What they forget is what lay beneath. Not merely cosmetics, but contradiction. Pain beneath poise, blood beneath perfume, rot beneath radiance. Her beauty secrets were not secrets at all. They were choices. Bold, strange, sometimes grotesque choices. And through them, she ruled not just Egypt, but the minds of those who came after. She made the monstrous beautiful, and the beautiful eternal. In the shaded chambers of the Alexandrian palace, far from the colonnades and echoing laughter of courtiers, Cleopatra kept a space untouched by diplomacy. It was not a room for scholars or scribes, not even for lovers or poets. It was a sanctuary of substancy, a chamber of transmutation. Here, time slowed. Here, matter was convinced to become magic. The walls were not adorned with royal crests or battle victories, but with linen tapestries stained by mixtures too ancient to name. Bronze basins lined the floor, each filled with liquid that shimmered unnaturally some dark as ink, others glinting green or purple under oil lamps suspended by brass chains. These basins held tinctures brewed from the bark of foreign trees, the shells of desert beetles, the oils pressed from seeds carried across continents. At the center of the room was a low stone table. Not polished marble, but rough limestone, stained with years of preparation. On it lay the tools: bone-handled razors, pestles worn to a curve by repetition, brushes made of jackal fur and papyrus fiber. Beneath the table, wrapped in linen bundles, were vials sealed with wax. These were not catalogued. They were known only by scent, by viscosity, by the way they caught the light. One was said to hold a solution derived from embalming fluid, reworked and softened with fig sap. Cleopatra used it not to preserve the dead, but to tighten the skin beneath her chin. It stung, but she smiled through it. Her attendants were never permitted to speak during preparation. Silence was the rhythm she required. It allowed her to feel the shift in her skin, the subtle warmth of each ingredient awakening her cells. On certain nights, she would smear her face with a paste of barley flour, donkey bile, and crushed fire ant spitter, sour, acrid. The fire ants were believed to bring heat to the skin, flushing the cheeks. After an hour, the mixture hardened into a crust. When peeled away, it took with it the topmost layer of skin, leaving behind a pink, raw sheen. She would then press cold obsidian stones to her cheeks, numbing the sting. These stones, carved in the shape of crescent moons, were kept in a basin of rainwater collected only during lunar eclipses. Her belief was that celestial alignment changed the potency of water, and whether that was true or not didn't matter. It was the belief that made it powerful. Another ritual involved the burning of herbs beneath a copper bowl. As the smoke rose, Cleopatra would hold her face above it, allowing the vapors to penetrate her pores. These herbs, scalamus root, juniper, and dried lotus were chosen not for their fragrance, but for their hallucinogenic effect. The queen claimed they gave her visions of herself, of her enemies, of beauty not yet invented. On one tablet discovered centuries later, there is a faint drawing in outline of Cleopatra's face surrounded by concentric circles, each labeled with a plant name. It is believed to be her scent chart, mapping how she layered odors not just for allure, but for influence. She wore smell-like armor. When she met foreign emissaries, she would change her scent hourly. During one audience with a Persian ambassador, her perfume shifted from cinnamon to myrrh to burning papyrus within the span of an hour. The man returned to his court raving not about treaties, but about how the queen made time feel unstable. This, too, was her design. There are accounts of her using fish, scala specifically those of Nile, perch boiled until gelatinous, then cooled into a film. She would stretch this over her cheeks and under her eyes, forming a translucent mask that tightened as it dried. It shimmered faintly, giving her an ethereal quality. Removal was delicate. If peeled too fast, it tore the skin. But Cleopatra had the patience of sediment. She knew that the slowest acts left the deepest impression. Even her hair, often described as thick and dark and coiled, was not left to chance. Once a week, it was soaked in a mixture of olive oil, ground locust shells, and goat marrow. The locust shells, when powdered, created a kind of shimmer that reflected lamplight. The goat marrow, heated and strained, added weight and structure. Her scalp was massaged with a blend of sea salt and black cumin to encourage blood flow, not for relaxation, but stimulation. Every follicle was a battlefield. She could not afford to lose ground. There are whispers, too, of a more unsettling practice. Of bloodletting not for health, but for clarity. Small incisions made on her thighs and shoulders, from which just enough blood was drawn to make her lightheaded. She claimed this brought her closer to the gods. That, in the moments after, her thoughts were more precise, her gaze more piercing. Her voice, when she spoke, seemed to echo. A ritual not of pain, but of reorientation. And perhaps the most disquieting of her practices involved a small bird known as the hoopoe. Revered in some parts of Egypt, reviled in others, the hoopoe was associated with secrets and the underworld. Cleopatra kept a cage of them, fed them a specific diet of herbs and resin. Their droppings, collected at dawn, were dried and used in eye ointments. When mixed with lapis powder and cedar oil, the result was a kohl, unlike any other black as absinthe, but with a subtle blue shimmer. When applied, it made her eyes appear deeper, endless, like pools that pulled thought itself inward. Her opponents couldn't hold her gaze for long. That, too, was her intent. She was crafting an experience, not a face. Each practice, no matter how grotesque, was a thread in the larger tapestry of her presence. It was never about being loved. It was about being remembered. And in the soft lamplight of her ritual chamber, as the shadows danced across clay walls and the scent of boiling bark filled the air, Cleopatra became more than flesh. She became suggestion, distortion, power. The beauty of disgust sharpened to perfection. Beneath the marble steps that led to the queen's private wing, in chambers seldom walked by foreign dignitaries or Roman generals, was a world of hushed rituals and earthly paradoxes. There, Cleopatra maintained not a salon of pleasure, but a sanctum of recalibration, a shrine of the grotesque made divine. In this subterranean haven, light filtered not through windows but through slits in the stone, scattering dimly across jars, amphorae, and bowls sealed with aged cloth. The air was dense with fermentation and clay, with the metallic tang of tools not cleaned, but aged into usefulness. One amphora stood allen taller than the rest and ringed with beeswax, its rim dark with residue. Its contents? A long-spoiled mixture of crocodile dung, fermented in mare's milk, strained through woven reeds, and then sun-dried for a week. Cleopatra applied this to her arms and chest, not for its texture, which was coarse and foul-smelling, but for its reputation. That crocodile waste contained spirits of the Nile beings too ancient for language. When dried and powdered, the result crackled on her skin like baked earth, tightening the flesh and coloring it faintly gold. During these applications, she would sit still for hours, listening only to the murmur of guards beyond the walls and the soft scratching of her attendants crushing more dung in a bronze mortar. It was believed that only the dung of crocodiles who had consumed gold-leafed offerings thrown into the river by desperate priests could offer the true effect. Whether true or not, her priests swore they could feel something emanating from her skin after use. Another less discussed practice involved the use of vinegar baths steeped with rusted iron shavings, not intended for cleansing but for transforming the skin's scent. The rust, once dissolved, gave the bath a reddish hue and a pungent tang, soaking into the pores and altering body chemistry. Some claimed it masked the human smell entirely, replacing it with something mineral, ancient, unknowable. She would bathe in silence, submerged up to her neck, while an attendant slowly poured additional vinegar down her spine. When she emerged, her skin would be slick, raw, tingling for hours. And then there was the bread mold, harvested not from fresh loaves, but from those hidden and allowed to rot in moist clay ovens. Once a thick blue-green crust formed, it was scraped, crushed, and blended with honey. This paste, rich in fungal life, was applied beneath the jawline and across the lower cheeks. The belief was that mold, alive and consuming, would digest impurities, and perhaps grant the skin a strange resilience. She referred to it in jest as her second digestion. Not even her most trusted advisors knew this part of her ritual. In the corner of her preparation room stood a squat, low fire basin. Above it, suspended on iron chains, hung a copper plate upon which she would place slivers of dried human placenta gathered during royal births and preserved with frankincense. As it warmed and smoked, she inhaled the fumes, her eyes closed, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. She believed it recalled her body to fertility, to youthful elasticity, that it reminded the body what it once was and could still be, if properly seduced. Her belief was not born of madness, but of philosophy. In Alexandria, the line between medicine, magic, and vanity was no line at all, it was a circle, and she stood always at its center. Her nails, never left to chance, were polished with a paste made of ground pearls, vinegar, and blood drawn from her own fingertips. The process was painful, intentionally so. She claimed the body responded best to rituals that involved sacrifice, however small, that the sting awakened deeper layers of skin, ones closer to the soul. After the polish dried, she'd apply a layer of melted beeswax and seal it by pressing her fingers briefly against the still-hot copper plate. The final sheen was neither red nor white, but a translucent coral, catching the light like a shell plucked from a cursed shore. Her feet, too, were treated not with oils or herbs, but with live leeches harvested from swamps near the Fayum oasis. These were not used to draw blood, but to consume the dead skin and stimulate nerves. Once affixed, they were left for precisely 17 minutes. If any fell before the time, they were considered weak and discarded into the river. If they held beyond, they were preserved, honored, sometimes even named. It was rumored Cleopatra kept a jar of her strongest leeches in her bedroom. A silent army of consumption. Her sense of time, always meticulous, extended to the phases of the moon. Certain treatments could only be applied when the moon was waxing, others only when waning. If a ritual coincided with a lunar eclipse, she would not speak for that entire day, communicating only through gesture and scent. One such day, during a red eclipse, she underwent her most extreme process, embedding crushed scorpion shell beneath the topmost layer of her skin. It was mixed with myrrh and applied with a blunt bone needle, pricking tiny holes along her collarbones and brow ridge. The result was a faint iridescent shimmer beneath the skin, barely perceptible but wholly unsettling to those who noticed. She claimed the scorpion, sacred and feared, lent her a protective aura, that when it lived within her skin, she could not be harmed. Even her teeth were not immune to transformation. She brushed them not with mint or chalk, but with burnt mouse bones, reduced to powder and mixed with crushed emerald. The bones lent abrasion. The emerald, she believed, lent brilliance. The taste was foul, metallic, and dry, but her smile, always faint, always deliberate, caught the light in a way that unsettled. It was a smile that remembered things others had forgotten, that knew things others feared to learn. There are few records of her sharing these rituals. They were not for spectacle. They were not even for legacy. They were for sovereignty. In her world, beauty was not softness. It was not attraction. It was weaponized strangeness, a kind of violence disguised as seduction. Each process, no matter how grotesque, was an act of control over body, over perception, over destiny. In the silence of those chambers, beneath the weight of oils, blood, and scent, Cleopatra became something no other queen had dared, a myth crafted not by poets, but by flesh. And in doing so, she rewrote the rules of presence, not merely to be seen, but to be believed. Even centuries later, the whispers of her rituals outlast the crumbling stone. A beauty born not of mirrors, but of transformation. The Nile, dark and undisturbed under a moonless night, was more than a river. It was a bloodstream for the gods, and Cleopatra, the alchemist of image and power, knew this with a reverence bordering obsession. She did not only bathe in its waters, she consumed them, filtered through linen, aged for 7 days, mixed with saffron and powdered lotus root. This concoction, lukewarm and bitter, was believed to nourish the humors and lend her voice a haunting softness. She drank it before every appearance, every speech, and even on nights she merely sat in solitude beside incense coils. Her attendants believed it gave her words a rhythm the ear could not forget. One of her lesser-known rites involved the use of rotting rose petals, not the fresh, fragrant blossoms gifted in ceremonies, but those left to wilt, darken, and curl at the edges in sealed terracotta jars. After 10 days, the petals released a pungent, almost vinegary oil. Cleopatra would rub this oil behind her ears and across her temples. She claimed it summoned memories, not just of her own life, but of her bloodline, of her ancestors, of former queens whose bones lay hidden beneath the shifting sands. She described it as wearing a thought someone else had left behind. On certain holy days, when Sirius rose before dawn, she prepared a face mask using crushed snail shells, dried bull liver, and fig sap. The mixture resembled thick, black mud and stank of metal. She applied it using a bird's feather, layer after layer, until her face became a still, rigid mask. While it dried, she did not speak. She did not move. Her eyes remained open the entire time, unblinking. For nearly an hour, she became a statue, neither living nor dead. Afterward, the mask cracked, revealing blood where the sap had adhered to tiny facial hairs. Her skin, though raw, glowed beneath the torchlight. But this was not for beauty alone. She believed the discomfort anchored her to the present. That pain stripped away illusion. One of the most unsettling details preserved in servant records involved a strange ritual with bee larvae. Brought fresh from hives placed on temple roofs, the larvae were kept alive in honey-filled bowls. At night, they were pressed still living into tiny slits cut along her inner arms. Not deep enough to bleed, but deep enough to sting. The warmth of her body would lull them, and as they dissolved in the honey's stickiness, their decay mixed with her own sweat. She claimed this process taught her mortality, that by fusing her essence with that of creatures bred to serve and die, she was reminded of the narrow thread separating queens from insects. Her lips, so often painted crimson, achieved their hue not with dyes but with powdered beetle husks, crushed in vinegar and boiled with goat marrow. The result was a thick, oily balm that reeked of iron. She applied it with a fingertip, always beginning with the bottom lip. This pattern was sacred. To reverse it was to risk misfortune. She told one confidant that the bottom lip held truth, the top deception, and that the order in which they were painted determined which ruled her words that day. When visiting tombs, especially of children or unmarried priestesses, she wore a necklace of teeth not gold or carved gems, but actual teeth, strung tightly on sinew. Each was scrubbed and oiled until they shone. It was not fashion, it was reverence. She believed the dead lent strength when carried with humility, that by adorning herself with their remains, she inherited their silence, their secrets, and their warnings. No part of her body escaped attention. Her eyelashes were trimmed daily not for beauty, but to allow for the application of smoke. A tiny brazier would be lit beside her dressing basin, filled with crushed dates and camel dung. As the smoke rose, she leaned in, eyes wide, until the lashes absorbed the blackness. They curled from the heat, darkened permanently. To some, this was simply makeup. To her, it was shadow made permanent, protection from the jealous eye. She kept in her private archives a roll of papyrus filled with body diagrams rudimentary but annotated in red ink. These marked where pain should be applied to awaken pleasure, tiny punctures with gold thorns. pinches with jade clips. Not all rituals were seen. Some were felt in solitude. In the farthest chamber of her quarters stood a basin carved from meteorite, cooled with sacred spring water. Here she would submerge her hands after each ritual. She believed the metal remembered things, that it stored her essence, and that by touching it daily she remained part of the stars. The guards who stood closest to that chamber reported strange sensation-stingling limbs, loss of speech, tears that arrived without cause. They never questioned it. Some begged to be reassigned. One, upon being denied, cut off 2 fingers and disappeared into the desert. Cleopatra's reactions to such events were always serene. She said transformation demanded witnesses. That madness was a natural byproduct of touching the divine. Her obsession with cleanliness was paradoxical. Despite the filth of many rituals, she demanded her chambers be scrubbed with vinegar and goat milk twice daily. Any attendant who failed to remove every trace of ash, blood, or oil was dismissed without a word. Yet she walked barefoot across floors, still wet with decay, still pungent with mold. She told a poet once that only in contrast could purity be felt. That true cleanliness was not absence of filth, but its transcendence. Perhaps the most disturbing practice involved her mirrors. There were only 3. Each faced a direction tied to a god. One for Isis, one for Set, one for Thoth. Before each ritual, she would speak to the mirror as if it were the deity itself, asking not for guidance, but for witness. If her reflection remained clear, she continued. If it wavered, she changed course. She once canceled a week of public ceremonies after seeing her image ripple in the mirror of Set. No one dared question her. Her life, to most, was a cascade of divine mysteries. To her, it was simply discipline. A discipline rooted in decay, in death, in transformation. Beauty, for Cleopatra, was never a surface. It was always a threshold, and she crossed it daily, leaving parts of herself behind each time. In doing so, she became something not merely remembered, but conjured, a specter of desire and revulsion, forever suspended between worship and warning. To understand the full weight of Cleopatra's transformation rituals, one must abandon modern associations with beauty and comfort. Her chambers were not places of pampering, they were sanctuaries of controlled rot, shrines of ritual pain and sensory overload. By the time the morning sun touched the alabaster columns, the queen had already undergone procedures most would flinch to imagine. She began her day, not with warmth, but with silence, broken only by the groan of clay jars being unsealed. These jars held fermented barley mash mixed with copper shavings prepared weeks in advance to accumulate just enough acidic bite to peel away the skin's outermost layer. A linen cloth, stiff with dried goat milk, was soaked in this liquid and pressed firmly against her face. For nearly an hour, Cleopatra sat motionless, allowing the solution to sting, tighten, and burn. Attendants were forbidden from looking directly at her during this time. She told them the gods were closest during pain and that unwanted eyes could provoke their jealousy. As the cloth was peeled away, tiny rivers of blood sometimes trickled down her cheeks. These were not accidents. They were offerings. They were necessary. Beneath her throne lay a flat slab of green-veined marble. It served not for seating, but for cleansing. After the mask, Cleopatra laid flat upon it, her arms outstretched. 2 elder handmaids then used smooth obsidian blades to scrape her skin-removing residue, dead flesh, and occasionally new skin that blistered during the treatment. The blades, honed daily, were so sharp that a single careless pass could open an artery, but no such error was ever recorded. Fear of failure ensured perfection. Her eyebrows were not plucked. Instead, they were removed entirely with a thread soaked in sheep bile and sulfur. The bile's sting was intense, but its residue left behind a faint sheen Cleopatra believed was divine. She would then have thin arches drawn anew, with coal and soot, always in a pattern mimicking the wings of vulture, symbols of protection and femininity, yes, but also of death circling high above. Her nails, both fingers and toes, were painted with a paste derived from crushed locust wings, hematite dust, and the oil of roasted hyena bone. The color was an iridescent gray, shifting slightly with torchlight. She believed this made her hands appear ghost-like, as though they had already passed into the afterlife. And that illusion, she whispered once to a servant, made men speak softer, fearing they addressed someone halfway to judgment. Perhaps one of the most harrowing elements of her regimen involved her scalp. Cleopatra shaved her head entirely every few days, not for fashion or cleanliness, but to allow full contact with her headplate. This was a crown-like instrument made of bronze, lined with ivory needles. It was placed snugly against her bare skull and tightened until it pressed the needles into her skin, not deeply enough to draw blood, but enough to leave pinpricks and tension. She wore this device for hours, sometimes under wigs, sometimes openly. She said it made her thoughts sharper, that it connected her to Horus, whose eye watched from above with relentless focus. The smell of her chambers was not floral, nor sweet. It was a mix of vinegar, salt, mold, and incense that clung to every surface. On colder mornings, slaves boiled a mixture of animal fat and myrrh to create a vapor that filled the air with something heavy, nearly suffocating. Cleopatra breathed this in deeply. She said it forced her lungs to remember that breathing was not effortless, that even life had to be earned. Her inner thighs were rubbed with a salve of honey and crushed stingray spine, mixed with powdered iron filings. It caused a low-burning sensation that pulsed for hours. Some believed this was an aphrodisiac, but her physician's journals described it differently. It was a deterrent, a punishment, a reminder of power not to be taken but endured. At meals, Cleopatra rarely ate first. Her food was tasted by 3 different servants, and often included ingredients designed not for nourishment but for symbolic consumption. Vulture tongues, prepared in lotus sauce, were served on golden plates. She believed eating the tongue gave her dominance over whispers. Boiled eel skin represented flexibility and dominance over betrayal. She rarely drank wine. Instead, she preferred a concoction of camel milk, pomegranate rind, and fermented beetroot juice. It stained her lips and her teeth slightly, creating a sickly pink hue. But she found beauty in the grotesque. She believed true allure lived just beyond repulsion. Her nightly preparation included a practice so secretive, it was recorded only in fragments. A pit in the far corner of her private garden, lined with limestone, housed dozens of toads kept alive and fed with insects harvested at dusk. At night, one was selected, placed in a cloth, and pressed against her chest while she lay beneath her cedar canopy. She would fall asleep to the creature's heart racing against hers. In the morning, it was gone. No trace, not a limb, not a bone. This ritual, she claimed, kept her dreams prophetic. Even her bedding was part of the illusion. The sheets were soaked in brine and dried beneath lunar light. They were stiff and rough against the skin, designed to keep her from sinking into comfort. She said soft dreams made soft rulers. The discomfort reminded her she was still alive. That comfort could be fatal, and woven into her every day was blood, not just her own, but that of animals, of virgins, of prisoners. Blood was used in her bath oils, in her perfumes, in the ink she used to write. A favorite mixture involved dove blood and jasmine extract. The scent was cloying, dizzying. Some said it made men forget their names. Others said it gave her the power to remember every conversation for months. Her presence in court, therefore, was more than visual. It was chemical, psychological. Her rituals, though revolting by modern standards, were not arbitrary. They were deliberate acts of identity. Every scar, every scent, every burn and stain was chosen. She wove her filth into majesty, her rot into reverence. And so, when foreign envoys met her gaze, they felt something they could not name. Not fear, not desire. Something more ancient. Something that whispered, "You are not speaking to a woman. You are speaking to a relic, a myth, a living warning." And Cleopatra, wrapped in smoke and salt and secret agony, never corrected them. Even as the sands of Egypt shifted and the empires around her fell into conflict, Cleopatra remained fixed in her designant artifact in motion, wrapped in ritual, insulated by secrecy. But her routines did not cease at the edge of the body. They extended into space, into sound, into the very architecture she touched. Her palace was a mechanism as much as it was a home, calibrated to the rhythms of her rituals. Hallways were laid not by convenience, but by orientation to stars. Each chamber resonated with a different tone produced by wind harps, embedded into walls and water channels that ran beneath the floors. These sounds, nearly imperceptible to others, were audible only to her in moments of silence. She believed they guided her breath. That breathing to the palace's song aligned her with the cosmos. Every step on polished stone became an act of synchronization, and those not attuned to this rhythm were said to lose their balance or become ill. Floors were scrubbed with salt and fig ash, creating an abrasive surface that wore down sandals and calloused feet. She chose to walk barefoot, claiming the burn grounded her, made her body aware of gravity and consequence. The burn was memory, she said. It prevented her from floating too far into divinity. In one chamber, the air was permanently scented with rotting papyrus. Scrolls soaked in goat urine and buried for weeks were later retrieved, dried, and set aflame in small braziers. The smell was acrid, unmistakable, but Cleopatra inhaled it with reverence. She claimed it allowed her to absorb forgotten wisdom, that burning the words released trapped knowledge back into the air, where she could catch it with her skin. Her headdresses, often admired for their complexity, were more than ornament. Many contained tiny bones woven into the lining bones of birds, rodents, sometimes infants retrieved from temple burials. She did not wear them for shock. She wore them to protect her from dreams. Bones, she believed, anchored her to the physical world. Without them, her mind might drift during ritual, become lost in the spirit plane she summoned. And she summoned often. There was one night each month, on the eve of the new moon, where she retreated to the obsidian chamber. This room, completely encased in black volcanic stone, contained no torches, no sound. Only a pit, a bowl of lamb's milk, and a single golden thread suspended from the ceiling. Cleopatra entered nude, carrying a carved onyx disc she placed against her heart. She then sat in the milk, submerged waist deep, and whispered a series of numbers, never words. These numbers changed each time, but followed a pattern she claimed was dictated by her dreams. The golden thread above would sway without wind, and when it stopped moving, she would rise, carve a small cut into her palm, and let the blood fall into the pit. It is said she emerged from these sessions with eyes so dilated they reflected flame like those of a cat. These practices were not metaphor, not poetry. They were deliberate steps in a lifelong pursuit of transcendence. She did not wish to rule as a woman, or even as a goddess. She wished to disappear into the fabric of myth, to become unreadable, undecipherable, to transform herself into a story that could never be fully grasped. Her servants, too, were drawn into this orbit. Their duties became rituals, their mystaka sacrifices. If a comb broke while passing through her hair, the pieces were not discarded but buried beneath the floor. If a cup cracked while she drank, it was placed on a pedestal and surrounded by salt. She believed broken things remembered the moment they failed, and she needed that memory to ward off future weakness. Her jewelry often contained parts of these objects. A ring might hold a shard of a shattered mirror. A bracelet might conceal the tooth of a dead slave who had once dressed her. These items were not gruesome to her. They were charms. They ensured continuity. She wore them the way others wore fate. Even the colors she allowed around her were curated with surgical intent. Red, unless representing blood, was forbidden. It signified rebellion. Blue was permitted only in its darkest form near black, symbolizing the Nile's depths. White was used sparingly, usually for binding cloths or wrapping sacred texts. Gold, however, was omnipresent not as a symbol of wealth, but of permanence. She once told a priest that gold did not shine, it remembered. That wearing it was not vanity but alliance. It remembered her skin, her scent, her rituals. In this way, Cleopatra existed in a continuous feedback loop of body and object, presence and residue. Even when she sat still, her surroundings completed her form. And in moments of solitude, when no attendants moved and no ceremonies rang out, she would often touch the base of her skull, where the headplate had pressed its needles, and murmur words from a language long extinct. Some believed it was Atlantean. Others claimed it was a cipher she created herself, letters inverted, meanings reversed. She spoke these words slowly, over and over, until the meanings slipped away and all that remained was sound. It is here, perhaps, that we see the essence of Cleopatra's beauty, this disassociation from definition. She did not seek to be beautiful by any measure but her own. She did not seek admiration. She sought awe. And awe, she knew, required discomfort. It required dirt beneath the fingernails and blood on the tongue. It required nights without sleep, baths that stung, mirrors that lied. Her final routine each day involved the lantern ritual. In a hallway lined with mirrors, each facing a different celestial direction, Cleopatra walked with a single lantern filled not with oil but with fermented crocodile fat. The flame it produced was greenish, flickering. As she passed each mirror, she paused and looked not at herself, but at what moved behind her. She said the reflections revealed what stalked her soul. If she saw a flicker just onset, she would end the ritual. If not, she continued until the flame died naturally. Sometimes this took hours. Her guards waited outside, listening to the creak of her footsteps. Once the lantern exploded in her hands. She emerged unharmed, covered in soot, and said only, "Tonight." The soul was impatient. These were not the routines of a monarch pampering herself. They were the liturgies of someone reshaping the very notion of identity. Someone transforming filth into a form of divine armor. Someone weaponizing discomfort, ambiguity, and decay. Cleopatra was not loved for her looks alone. She was feared for her refusal to be understood. She was revered for becoming a temple to contradiction, a living statue, crumbling by design, radiating an allure no one could touch without being changed. And as night settled over the ancient city, as her palace exhaled incense, and the Nile whispered to the moon, Cleopatra stood alone, beautiful and terrifying, the embodiment of ancient filth. She had become not a woman, but a ritual, one that, even in memory, stains the mind. As the final stars above Alexandria gave way to the watery glow of morning, Cleopatra would sometimes sit in silence and press her fingers to her lips not to speak, but to feel whether her voice still lived within them. This ritual was quiet, unseen by attendants. She believed that a ruler's tongue, if left unchecked, could become a blade that cut blindly. So, before any decree or conversation, she paused in stillness and reminded herself that sound is responsibility. The gesture was simple, but it came after nights heavy with noise. Not public noise, not the sound of festivals or courtly debate. These were private noises, echoes of grinding bone paste, of vinegar bubbling in bronze bowls, of wet hair pulled too tightly, strands breaking with a brittle snap. These sounds layered themselves into her chambers like sediment, and Cleopatra carried them forward not as trauma, but as texture. Her world was curated down to vibration. Even her footsteps were calculated. Sandals lined with fish bladder were discarded in favor of papyrus soles soaked in pig's blood. The resulting sound on the marble floors was damp, soft, disturbingly organic. She said it reminded her that death walked beside her, echoing every step. When she wanted silence, she did not seek quiet. She commanded it with presence. There was a day each month, known only to her inner circle, when Cleopatra would not speak at all. This was not a vow of humility. It was a test. Her attendants had to interpret her wishes from gestures, from the movement of her eyes, from the placement of her fingers against her neck or wrist. It was a day of performance, of alignment, of unspoken power. And when the silence broke, her first words were recorded in wax tablets, then burned. Not saved, burned. Words, she said, should not be archived like stones. They should vanish like incense. These beliefs bled into how she prepared for public appearances. Unlike other rulers who draped themselves in silk and scent, Cleopatra often arrived at court in garments laced with threads hairsome her own, some from those she defeated. The fabric scratched, caught light strangely, clung to the skin. It made those near her feel unsteady, but it made her feel anchored. Her entrances were preceded by centimeter grease and salt, ox blood and frankincense. People often noticed the aroma before they saw her, and once they did, they couldn't forget it. Her skin sometimes shimmered faintly, but not from oil or gold. It came from ground pearl mixed with powdered eggshell and goat marrow, applied as a thin, wet glaze before it dried into a film. The mixture cracked subtly when she moved, 1,000 tiny fractures that, from afar, looked like illumination. She claimed it mimicked the desert itself smooth, until pressure revealed its hidden breaks. Her voice, when she did speak, was not particularly loud, but it was impossibly steady. This steadiness came from years of training with throat stonosmal, polished orbs made of quartz and copper that she held under her tongue for hours at a time. They distorted her saliva, left metallic residue, sometimes caused ulcers, but they strengthened her vocal cords. Her sound became unmistakable, unnerving. Even in laughter, there was no shake. She could recite poetry in a sandstorm and not falter, and she did. More than once, during festivals dedicated to Bastet, she would stand outside, exposed to wind and dust, reciting prayers to a crowd that could barely hear her, but could always feel her. That was the point. Presence over volume. Intention over noise. Her food, by this stage in life, had become entirely symbolic. She no longer consumed for hunger. Meals were orchestrated. She would sit at an obsidian table and be offered items based on recent dreams. One night, she might be served figs soaked in serpent venom detoxified, but still retaining their sting. Another, a soup of crushed antler, lotus root, and honey harvested only during eclipses. She rarely swallowed more than a mouthful. It was the gesture, the echo of the offering, that nourished her. Her bathwater was no longer water at all. It was a base of fermented milk mixed with trace metals, gold flakes, copper dust, sometimes mercury in microscopic doses. It caused her skin to redden, pulse, swell slightly before tightening. The sensation was described by one slave as drowning in 1,000 ants, but Cleopatra said it was cleansing. She believed pain pushed impurities from the blood to the skin's edge, where they could be shed like old belief. Even her dreams were curated. In the center of her private garden stood a statue with no face, carved from meteorite. Each night, Cleopatra would press her forehead to its chest and whisper confessions not of guilt, but of desire. She said the facelessness ensured no judgment, and the stone's cosmic origin made it an impartial witness. She claimed that on nights when she skipped the ritual, her dreams lost color. In one recorded vision, she stood on the Nile's surface, her body covered in leeches spelling ancient words. She awoke bleeding from her feet, no cause found. From then on, she never skipped a night. In her final known years, Cleopatra's rituals grew stranger still. She commissioned a chamber beneath her quartershaft underwater, accessible only during low tide. Inside, the walls were coated in a fungus that glowed faintly green. She would sit in the water, chin deep, surrounded by the sound of dripping stone and the hum of unseen life. This, she said, was the closest she ever felt to disappearing. And disappearing for her was the goal. Not death, not escape. Transformation. She wanted to become myth before breath left her body. She believed that if her rituals were intense enough, beautiful enough, revolting enough, they would anchor her soul into memory itself, that the world would never forget what it had dared to witness, and she succeeded. For even now, centuries later, we speak her name not as history, but as spell. We imagine her not as flesh and blood, but as an apparition wrapped in gold and grime, scent and sorrow. She became her own afterlife. She buried herself alive in ritual and rose eternal. In the final chamber, where she slept sealed now beneath layers of time and stoner, is said to be a single inscription carved into the wall. Not a name, not a title, a question. What did you make of your own decay? A question for those who would follow, for those who think beauty is soft, for those who have never dared to rot with purpose. Before the myth solidified, before Rome turned her into symbol and Alexandria into memory, there was a slower Cleopatra who moved through her palace like a drifting storm cloud, neither rushed nor still, whose beauty no longer served others but fed something deeper within herself. By the time her reign matured into ritual and resistance, her body had become its own form of protest. No longer just adorned, no longer merely displayed. It was now encrypted, layered with secretions, elements, textures, symbols meant to deflect interpretation. The more the outside world tried to define her, the more she embedded chaos into her form. And the chaos was calculated. Her skincare, once involving crushed pearls and rose water, now depended on things fermented, rancid, painful. Rot was no longer feared. It was curated. Old recipes included rotting fish scales soaked in urine, left for days until gelatin formed. This she applied to her arms and shoulders, saying the sourness trained the skin to tighten in defense. Vinegar, mixed with charred beetle shells, produced a black paste she rubbed behind her knees and elbows, those tender folds where sweat hides secrets. It left a stain, it stung, but she welcomed it, called it a boundary between worlds. Her lips were no longer tinted with pigment alone. She blended powdered iron with ox marrow, stirring until the texture turned sticky. This mixture, when applied, darkened over time, drying into a crust that would occasionally crack during speech or laughter. The cracks, she believed, allowed thoughts to escape in their rawest form. If someone noticed the flakes fall from her mouth mid-sentence, she'd pause, catch them with a finger, and taste them. Iron, she said, reminded her of memory, metallic, sharp, always nearby, just under the surface. Hair, once a matter of style, was now a battlefield of discipline. She shaved the crown of her head every third night, not for cleanliness, but for control. She said the scalp held dreams. Exposing it to moonlight forced the mind to confront its shadows. Oils applied afterward were pungent boiled mint, bat guano, remnants of candle smoke trapped in cloth, and wrung into clay pots. When rubbed into the exposed scalp, it produced a sensation somewhere between burning and freezing. Her eyes, too, had shifted. No longer simply rimmed in kohl for beauty, they were now painted with mixtures that obscured color. Crushed mold spores, mixed with salt and goat milk, created a gray-blue haze that clouded her vision just enough to blur the line between what was and what could be. She liked it, said it made people look like ghosts, like truths with soft edges. It reminded her that no one, not even gods, saw clearly. Clothing had become statement and shield. Under her formal robes, she often wore linen soaked in salt brine and left to stiffen. These garments scraped against her skin, leaving thin red lines like secret script. She claimed the sting kept her alert during ceremonies, that discomfort forced her to speak with precision. Jewelry carried not wealth, but memory. Each ring, each chain, each earring contained elements taken from failed moments-melted arrowheads, from ambushes, teeth from spies, beads crafted from the fingernails of assassins. To wear them was to remind herself what survival cost. Her favorite necklace, it said, contained a tiny vial filled with her own tears collected during moments of rage. She wore it over her heart. When questioned why, she answered only, "Because I cannot drink them." And her meals, reduced now to symbolism, had begun to reflect the grotesque beauty of decay. Fruit left just past ripeness. Cheese bordering on rot. Bread blackened with ash. She believed the moment just before spoilage contained the most truth, that too fresh was deceptive and too rotten was dead. She wanted to consume what teetered on the edge. Even her sleep was no longer restful. The beds had changed. No more silks or soft cushions. She slept on layers of reed and broken pottery, rearranged nightly so her body never adapted. Her pillow was a block of scented wood, carved with symbols from dreams. Attendants sometimes heard her muttering in sleep, her breath sharp as if fighting. She said this was how she trained for death. That sleep should not comfort, but prepare. Mirrors were covered when she passed them, not out of vanity, but to prevent the risk of reflection stealing part of her soul. If she did gaze into glass, she did so only after smearing her face with soot or mud, so the image returned was incomplete. She didn't want to be seen whole. Wholeness, she claimed, was an illusion. Even language had become corrupted by ritual. Words she once used with ease were now broken apart. She spoke in partial sentences, inverted grammar, whispered pauses. Those closest to her learned to translate, but outsiders were unnerved. The Empress did not speak like a human anymore. She spoke like a storm learning restraint. Documents from diplomats described conversations with her as like listening to a riddle being whispered through glass. Yet this dissonance was intentional. Cleopatra had ceased wanting to be understood. She wanted to be interpreted, and interpretation creates legacy. Each layer of her being, each ritual, each scar or scent or silence was a thread in the fabric of her legend, and she stitched it tightly, refusing to leave a single edge unburned. She had come to see her body as not just a temple, but as a ruin in progress. Something sacred because it was crumbling deliberately. And in doing so, she became eternal not because of beauty as we know it, but because of the horror beneath it. She became unforgettable because you cannot look away from something you don't know how to name. In the darker wings of the palace where torchlight flickered on uneven stone and the air smelled of lime and burned resin, Cleopatra kept a chamber that few knew about and even fewer entered. It was not a room of rest, nor a place of courtly luxury. It was known among her closest attendants only as the Chamber of Becoming. The walls were lined with polished slate, not to reflect light, but to absorb it. Every surface pulled shadow inward. No gold adorned the space, no jewels, no symbols of royalty. Here she stripped herself not only of clothing but of identity. Every mark of her as queen, consort, mother, goddess was removed before she stepped inside. Her hair was unbound, lips bare, fingers scraped clean of lacquer. And in the center of the room, sunk into the ground like a forgotten grave, was a basin filled with a thick, tar-like mixture said to contain the remains of animals struck by lightning, ashes of scrolls deemed too dangerous to preserve, and water drawn from the Nile only during eclipses. She would enter the basin slowly, wading into the viscous black substance until it reached her chest, and she'd close her eyes and stand still for hours. Not meditate, not pray, simply stand, as if waiting for something inside her to break loose. Some claimed the mixture drew heat from the body. Others said it heightened awareness to pain. Cleopatra herself never explained it. She only said, "Here, I dissolve." The ritual did not end with her emergence. She did not dry herself but let the mixture harden on her skin. The cracking texture that followed was considered sacred, a kind of second skin, brittle and imperfect, that she wore beneath her garments until it fell away naturally, piece by piece. She believed these fragments carried away fragments of the self she no longer needed. In time, these pieces were collected and buried in small jars, each labeled with a date and a single word: fear, love, doubt, rage. These were not metaphors. She truly believed parts of her soul were being shed and stored, like molted snakeskin. The jars remain unaccounted for. Some say they were hidden beneath the Library of Alexandria before its fall. Others claim they were placed inside tombs of lesser queens to confuse future historians. A few suggest they were consumed in secret rites by her closest inner circle ritual cannibalism to absorb her essence. Whatever the truth, those who spoke of the jars never lived long afterward. The transformation did not stop with flesh. Cleopatra's voice, already trained through years of mineral and silence, now took on a new cadence. She began speaking in dual rhythm surds, repeated with slight variations, one in the register of command, the other in lamentation. It was said that hearing her speak was like being told a story and mourning it at the same time. The effect was disorienting. Some wept without knowing why. Others became still, as if hypnotized. This method of communication extended even into written form. Scrolls penned by her hand would feature 2 columns of text, one literal, one metaphorical. Together, they created a web of meanings. Alone, they seemed incomplete. The same duality permeated her appearance. Makeup was now applied in layers meant to contradict, one eye outlined in gold, the other in soot, one hand painted with henna, the other left raw and pale. Her breath was scented differently, on each side of her mouth rose petals chewed on one side of the tongue, frankincense resin on the other. To speak to her was to experience imbalance. And that, she said, was the point. Symmetry is how lies hide, she once told a scribe. The truth stumbles. Her rituals grew even more abstract. She began assigning emotions to colors and burning them in isolated ceremonies. If she felt envy, she would paint a fig leaf in a particular shade of green, then watch it burn in silence. If longing, she'd soak linen in lavender oil and ignite it in a silver bowl. The smell was intoxicating, the fire unpredictable. She believed the flame's shape revealed the depth of the emotion's hold on her. One night, an entire room was filled with red light as dozens of orange marigolds, dipped in animal blood, were set ablaze on her birthday. She said nothing, watched, inhaled the smoke with her eyes wide open. Her body reacted violent shaking, sweating, purging, and she called that reaction proof of purification. Her physicians begged her to stop. She replaced them with those who did not speak. Eventually, she trained a small group of mute servants who tended to her during these rituals. They wore masks made of dried pomegranate peel and communicated only through scent and touch. One squeeze of her left wrist meant, "The mixture is ready." A faint trace of vinegar near her pillow signaled, "The moon is at midpoint." Her life had become a code, decipherable only to those who had abandoned the desire to understand. Her court watched helplessly as their queen unraveled herself on purpose. But to Cleopatra, it was not unraveling. It was distillation. She believed that legacy did not come from preservation, but from deliberate erosion. That what survives of you is not what you keep, but what you scar into the world around you. And so she carved, with her choices, with her rituals, with her decay. By the waning days of her reign, Cleopatra's beauty could no longer be discussed without invoking fear. It wasn't the radiance of youth nor the calculated charm of politics that had transformed into something more occult, more fractured, more incomprehensible. It was no longer designed to seduce or manipulate. It was designed to haunt, to unsettle, to whisper through time. Visitors to the palace would speak of her presence with trembling reverence. Not because of what she wore or how she looked, but because she felt like something you shouldn't witness but couldn't look away from. It began, they said, with her scent. No longer floral, no longer perfumed in a way that pleased. Instead, she carried the aroma of old libraries, dried skin, scorched linen, honey fermenting in the sun, clay soaked in wine and left for days to sour. It was the smell of history, of rot and reverence intermingling. And it clung to her, even when she was gone. Her throne room had been transformed. What once held silk banners and ivory columns now housed vessels filled with desiccated flowers, animal bones painted with ash, and cracked mirrors that distorted one's reflection. The light was always low. Candles burned with colored flames, green from copper salts, purple from crushed shells and powdered stone. The flames flickered irregularly, casting shadows that danced out of rhythm with the world. Cleopatra would sit, not upon a throne, but on a slab of black basalt that had been polished smooth by generations of silent followers. Her fingers often moved through bowls of ground pigment or stitched coarse threads through parchment bearing no words. She called it thinking. She spoke less and less, and when she did, it was in riddles or ancient dialects rarely understood even in her time. Some believed she was speaking to the dead. Others thought she was speaking to her future self, sending messages across centuries. Her nails, once manicured and adorned, were now stained with ink and bloodroot, symbols etched into the surface, tiny glyphs of protection, destruction, and rebirth. They were maps, she claimed, of her inner geography. Her eyes were hidden more often than seen. Veils of fine mesh, smeared with ochre and dust, hung from her headdress, filtering her gaze like a fog. On rare occasions when the veils were lifted, her stare was described as remembering something you never lived. It paralyzed even seasoned envoys. Her daily rituals no longer followed any recognizable calendar. Sometimes, at the cusp of dusk, she would descend barefoot into the palace cisterns, where water lay stagnant and cold. There she'd float for hours, wrapped in white muslin soaked in fig sap and vinegar, her breath timed with the ripples echoing against stone. At other times, she would climb to the roof at midnight and smear her body with ground amber and ash while staring at the stars until dawn. She believed the heavens could erase parts of her memory if she stared long enough. And she wanted to forget selectively, deliberately. Her meals became more esoteric. Tongue of eel soaked in ink, figs pierced with silver needles, milk from animals starved of salt. Each dish served not for pleasure but for confrontation. She wanted her body to experience discomfort, surprise, even betrayal. She said a queen must never become numb. Even her silences held structure. There were days when no one was allowed to speak in her presence. Not servants, not priests, not lovers. Only gestures and eye contact. These were led days of the void, and during them Cleopatra would walk the palace in slow spirals, brushing her fingers against stone, leaving faint trails of red dust behind her. It was as though she was unspooling herself into the architecture. Her death rituals had already begun, years before her body would follow. She commissioned burial wrappings infused with crushed beetle carapace and ash from burned love letters. Each layer encoded a memory-some real, some imagined, some deliberately twisted. These wrappings were not for her corpse, they were for practice. Once a month, she would wrap herself and lie in the stone chamber for hours, breathing through reeds soaked in mint and myrrh. This was rehearsal. She wanted her soul to recognize the feeling of confinement. And if it did, she believed it would know how to escape. Legacy had become her obsession. Not the kind etched on coins or statues, but the kind that unsettled centuries. The kind that made future historians argue. The kind that bled into dreams. She hid messages in walls, beneath tiles, inside the folds of garments never worn. Spells, curses, truths disguised as contradictions. She wrote letters to unborn daughters, to future queens, to scholars she knew would misinterpret her. She wanted to be misunderstood, because misunderstanding is a form of immortality. When a figure is argued about, reinterpreted, feared they are never truly gone. So she fed the myth. She rotted it on purpose. She buried beauty under horror, made elegance taste like iron, and honey, and dust. And in that grotesque alchemy, Cleopatra became something else entirely. Not woman, not queen, not goddess. She became contagion. The kind that spreads through memory, through story, through scent and symbol and silence. The kind that outlives empires. By the time Cleopatra entered what some now call her final metamorphosis, the palace had become less a place of power and more a vessel of decay. Visitors who stepped into its grand corridors found themselves not in awe, but in a slow, suffocating disorientation, as if time slowed or bent under invisible weight. The floor tiles, once pristine with Greek marble, were worn soft by bare feet and constant cleansing with vinegar and ash. Even the air had changed. It hung heavy with the scent of old fig wine, mummified flowers, stale incense, and something more metallic, like rusted copper or dried blood. Her presence was no longer immediate. She had become elusive. Some said she wandered the halls in silence, dragging the hem of her blackened linen gown across the floor like a brushstroke meant to erase the past. Others claimed she moved only by candlelight now, communicating with gestures, or in riddles so vague that they could be interpreted as prophecy or madness, depending on the listener's guilt. Her beauty rituals, once reserved for herself, began to demand an audience. Once a week, chosen members of her court were summoned to witness her unveilings, long drawn-out ceremonies where she would undress layer by layer, not to seduce, but to reveal what she called the hidden rot beneath all thrones. These ceremonies were painful to watch. Her skin was often smeared with crushed beetles, thick layers of honey mixed with coal dust, or bruised fruit left to ferment on her arms until it dripped. Each texture had meaning, each scent a story, each mark a sermon. She never explained, but those who returned from these sessions reported dreams of drowning, of their teeth falling out, of ancient birds nesting in their mouths. It became clear her beauty was not meant to comfort. It was meant to infect. Rumors began to grow that those who stared too long at her veiled face began to forget the names of their children, that she spoke a word into the ear of a Roman general, and his eyes turned cloudy with milk by dawn, that she whispered into scrolls and sealed them in jars, each curse calibrated for whoever dared read them centuries later. Some dismissed these tales as hysteria. Others began carrying amulets, garlic bulbs, or scribbled prayers beneath their robes. She noticed, and she smiled. "You call it filth," she once said, "because you fear what beauty looks like without permission." Her skin was no longer luminous. It had taken on a sallow, dappled texture, mottled like old parchment. But this, she insisted, was sacred. "This is the surface of time," she whispered once to a chambermaid, "and I wear it without shame." Her teeth, once pearl polished with ground bone and vinegar, now bore gray stains from unknown substances she chewed at night resins from foreign trees, powders made from charred texts, stones that had never been named aloud. Her eyes, often half-lidded and glistening with tears that never fell, seemed always to be watching something no one else could see. And her voice had changed again. It no longer came in words but in sequences of tones and breaths, a melodic keening that sometimes resembled lullabies and sometimes sounded like mourning. She claimed it was a lost language only the dying could understand. People began avoiding her chambers. Priests fumbled their rituals in her presence. Lovers found themselves impotent or ill. And yet, she never raised a hand. She needed no violence. Her presence did the harm. Her alchemy was no longer in ointments, or elixir was in silence, suggestion, scent. Her beauty had become spiritual warfare. Her chambers, once filled with mirrors and gilded furniture, were now near empty. A single chair carved from petrified wood. Bowls of salt, a length of rope that she touched often but never used. On the walls, no paintings, no scrolls, only faint carvings in the plaster that appeared overnight symbols of eyes without lids, mouths sewn shut, wombs split open like fruit. She no longer slept in her bed but on the cold stone floor, surrounded by broken amulets and shards of obsidian. "Dreams must bleed," she explained once when a physician offered her opium. Her meals had become sparse. A peeled grape dipped in vinegar, a spoonful of spoiled honey, a petal of blue lotus frozen in ice. She claimed hunger sharpened her visions. She bathed no longer in milk but in smoke, standing naked as thick plumes of burning herbs curled around her, inhaling deeply until her voice cracked and her eyes watered. Her beauty was no longer meant for admiration. It was a warning, a reminder. That power, when left alone too long in silence and sorrow, does not rotit, transforms into something feral, something holy, something terrifying. Her legacy had turned inward. Her rituals now left no record, only trauma. Her attendants wore gloves to avoid touching her directly. She required no touch, only witness, and those who witnessed could not forget. The queen was dissolving, not in defeat, but in design. The longer Cleopatra drifted into this twilight version of herself, the more the world outside began to fracture in reflection. She had become less a woman, less a ruler, and more a gravitational pull phenomenon. Whispers spread across Alexandria that even the sun seemed reluctant to shine over her palace, that birds avoided nesting on the roof, That cats, once her sacred companions, now mewled and hissed at empty corners when they roamed her halls. The fountains in her gardens ran with water that tasted faintly of salt and wine, and no one could explain why the fish swimming in them developed translucent scales and red eyes. The plants bloomed out of season, petals curling inwards as if they were trying to hide from something only they could perceive. Foreign diplomats continued to arrive, out of obligation more than curiosity, but none stayed longer than a day. They spoke of hallways that whispered their names, of shadows that lingered even in torchlight, and of Cleopatra herself, a figure who now resembled a myth more than flesh. They could not remember her words, only her presence. It made their stomachs twist, and their memories skip like damaged scrolls. They left gifts, not out of diplomacy, but as offerings. Salt, knives, feathers, locks of their own hair, as though bargaining for protection. And still, Cleopatra watched, silent, detached. Her physical appearance no longer seemed fixed. Some days she was skeletal, eyes sunken and limbs frail, draped in torn linen stained with fig sap and ash. Other days her skin gleamed with oil and crushed pearls, her hair woven with bone and silver thread. But always, always, she moved slowly, like a dream walking, like someone trying not to wake up. Those who served her learned to avoid direct questions. She answered in dreams, in gestures, in breath that smelled of iron and honey and something older. She painted symbols on her skin before sleeping, and in the morning they were gone, absorbed, she claimed, by the veins. Her body had become scripture. In the evenings, she sat in a circle of broken mirrors, not to gaze at herself, but to confuse the spirits. Reflections are doorways, she once murmured to a frightened attendant, but only if they crack. She drank infusions brewed from herbs, long band nightshades steeped in goat milk, datura mixed with oil from crushed scorpions. She said they silenced the lies of the flesh. She no longer wanted comfort. She wanted clarity, and clarity, she believed, came only through suffering. Pain was the last honest thing. Her temple, once adorned with gold and perfumed smoke, now smelled of stone and vinegar. Candles were replaced with jars of glowing moss, their light soft and green like the bottom of a lake. She walked barefoot across mosaics she had once commissioned, now dulled and broken by years of deliberate neglect. The patterns no longer resembled gods or stories, they looked like disease. The priests feared her. Even the high priest of Isis, once her advisor, began to mutter prayers backwards as he walked past her door. He believed her blood had changed, that she had opened herself to something too old, too deep, and maybe she had. Her dreams became prophecies. She wrote them in charcoal on the walls of the bathhouse, where steam carried the ink into the pores of her servants. "Let them dream with me," she whispered. "Let them carry it." And they did. One woman tore out her tongue after dreaming of speaking the queen's name aloud in a storm. Another drowned herself in the reflecting pool after seeing Cleopatra's face smile through the water backwards. But Cleopatra showed no grief, only stillness, only deeper quiet. Her rituals evolved again. She began burying objects in the soil beneath her chamber teeth, fish bones, pieces of broken combs, petals soaked in menstrual blood and salt. She said the earth remembered everything, and she wanted it to remember her correctly, not as a ruler, but as an infection. "They will dig me up," she said once, eyes hollow, "and they will not find gold. They will find warnings." Her beauty was now something primal, something repellent and magnetic at once, not unlike fire or plague. It drew the curious. It punished the unprepared. No longer cosmetic, no longer performative, her beauty was ritualized rot, encoded madness, purposefully spoiled, and yet it lived. It moved. It breathed. It had become a second skin, stitched not from makeup and oil, but from belief and myth and fear. Those who dared touch hair in rare days when she allowed it described the sensation not as warmth, but as memory, as if touching her was remembering something awful that had never happened to you. A curse inherited without ancestry. Her identity began to vanish, not by force, but by her own unraveling. She referred to herself less and less by name. Sometimes she signed decrees with a smear of pigment instead of script. Other times she would press her lips to parchment and let the shape of her mouth serve as signature. She was erasing herself from the records, even as she redefined them. And this was not decay. This was intention. This was design. She was becoming legend not through conquest, not through diplomacy, but through unease, through the haunting aftertaste of her rituals, through the scent that lingered long after she left a room, through the slow spread of her name whispered not in reverence, but in dread. Cleopatra had become a sickness that the empire could not diagnose, and that was how she planned to survive it. By the time Cleopatra's rituals reached their most unrecognizable form, no one called them rituals anymore. They were not practices to be learned, not traditions to be passed down. They had become symptoms. Symptoms of a transformation that had stopped being human. The few attendants who still dared remain near her presence no longer treated her as queen, nor even as oracle. They treated her as something elemental, like a storm or a well with no bottom. She stopped wearing garments, not out of exhibitionism, but because cloth could not keep up with her body. It wept oils. It shed powder. It bruised in shapes resembling hieroglyphs never carved before. Each day, her skin mapped something new. And each day, something she touched stopped functioning properly. Lamps would flicker and die, papyrus would curl, wine would sour instantly. It was said even time moved differently in her chamber. Sand in the hourglass thickened. Shadows no longer aligned with the sun. People entered and forgot why, left with marks they didn't remember receiving. She no longer slept. She no longer ate. Her sustenance came from silence, from the fear of others, from the stories told about her before she entered the room. She fed on myth, and the more they whispered, the more she grew unbearable. Her voice became a kind of chant, not melodic, but cyclical. A rhythm of sounds and clicks and breath that made listeners nauseous, like the pitch was tuned to some ancient part of the brain meant to remain dormant. Her hands trembled constantly, yet her touch left permanent burns like cold fire. Her breath smelled of salt and rot and saffron. People who inhaled near her found themselves weeping without cause. Some said she no longer cast a shadow. Others claimed she cast too many. She would stand by the window at dusk, and her silhouette would multiply for 5, 6 different outlines trembling against the wall, moving independently, some crawling upward, others folding in on themselves. At times, she would smear her own blood across the floor and draw spirals, then walk barefoot through them for hours, humming low, guttural sounds. When questioned, she only said, "This is the shape of memory." Her name was no longer written in court documents. Instead, a symbol was used, a black sun with weeping rays. Even Rome began to hesitate. Augustus sent envoys not with demands, but with questions, not about politics, about her, about whether she still breathed, whether she could still be reasoned with. The envoys returned silent, or did not return at all. The few who spoke again talked in riddles, about rooms that felt like skin, about eyes carved into walls, about doors that whispered threats before they opened. She was no longer a woman, she was a sight, a place, an atmosphere. The Egyptians stopped praying to the old gods inside her palace. They feared the gods might answer and find her already waiting. Even the high priest of Isis declared her the final form of devotion and sealed himself inside a tomb, claiming he would not live to see what she would become. The people no longer cheered her name. They murmured it only during illness, as though invoking a fevered cure. Her legacy was burning, and she was stoking the fire, not to destroy herself, but to leave no other version. Every mirror in the palace had been shattered. Every likeness of her face scraped from coin and fresco. Her orders, her will, her design. She did not want to be remembered as beautiful. She wanted to be remembered as necessary. Necessary like plague, like famine, like flood. Something that arrives and remakes the world, not through choice, but inevitability. Her final beauty was not one of surface. It was a kind of narrative infection. To know her was to be reshaped. To witness her was to forget what came before. And so, in the final days before her empire fell, before Rome pressed in fully, Cleopatra performed one last transformation. She carved symbols into her arms, bathed in smoke from burned linen and laurel, kissed each corner of her chamber and whispered, "Now you remember." She painted her eyelids with soot and honey and lay not on silk, but on salt. And when the guards finally broke through the doors days, maybe weeks later, they did not find a body. They found only skin, folded neatly, hollow like a cocoon. And the scent of myrrh and vinegar still strong in the air, as though she had only just left, or never truly had, the city mourned. Not out of grief, but relief, because the fever had broken. The story had ended, or so they thought. But in dreams, she returned. Not always as herself. Sometimes as a sound, sometimes as a scent, sometimes as a woman with eyes too large and lips too pale, whispering, "You see me now, don't you?" And those who saw her again were never quite right afterward. They stopped sleeping. They stopped eating. Some began smearing honey on their arms. Others began humming to their mirrors. And so her final beauty lived on. Not in marble, not in history, but in behavior. In disease. In women who refused to smile. In men who flinched at perfume. In rooms that grew cold for no reason. Cleopatra did not die. She multiplied. They thought her gone. They thought the salt and skin she left behind were the end of her, the final punctuation on a life spent in rituals and whispers. But legacies do not die where bodies fall. They ferment. They echo. They mutate. And Cleopatra's legacy was no longer one of history, it was one of infection. After her disappearance, Alexandria struggled to breathe. The air felt thicker. The water tasted sour. Statues cracked without reason. Cats left the city in droves. Fishermen claimed the sea grew quiet, as if mourning something ancient. And at night, dreams came differently. Citizens began waking with symbols on their arms etched in dust, or bruised faintly in patterns they didn't recognize. Women woke with their mouths tasting of honey and ash. Men heard her voice in fountains. Children whispered her name without knowing who she was. Something of her had embedded itself into the city's very bones. The priests refused to speak of her. The scholars pretended she had never ruled. New leaders issued decrees banning her image, her name, even the black sun symbol she had adopted in her final years. But the more they erased her, the deeper she sank into the stone. Her temple, once emptied and sealed, began to grow moss on the inside. Vines appeared overnight, curling into patterns resembling her profile. No one dared touch them. Merchants reported seeing figures wearing her perfume in the market smelling of myrrh, vinegar, salt. When followed, the figures vanish. Head. Mirrors began to crack without pressure. Dogs barked at corners. And then came the imitators. Women began painting their eyes in styles not seen since Cleopatra's reign. They burned herbs not for fragrance, but for visions. They scratched words into their dorsum in Greek, some in languages older than hieroglyphs. They wrapped their hair in silver wire. They spoke less. They wept during rain. One noblewoman buried herself alive in a clay tub filled with crushed beetles and goat's milk, claiming she would emerge as something closer to the queen. She never emerged. But the soil around her house grew black and rich, and the roses that bloomed there were redder than any seen before. And then came the writings, scrolls unearthed by accident, books that should not have survived fires, passages that read like prayers but felt like warnings. Let her rot beneath your tongue, one line read, only then will you speak true. Another, to mirror her is to forget yourself. To remember her is to be changed. Scholars, of course, dismissed them, called them apocrypha, but none of them would sleep with a candle out afterward. Over time, her legacy slipped beyond Alexandria. Traders carried stories to Rome, to Carthage, to forgotten villages near the Caspian Sea. And those stories warped. She became not just a queen, but a creature. Not just a woman, but a scent, a shape, a ritual. In some regions, young girls were warned. If you sleep with coal on your eyes, she will visit, and she will leave a bruise where your voice used to be. In others, her name was used to bless and to curse. depending on how it was said. Sailors claimed her image, appeared in fog, mouthing words in languages that broke teeth to pronounce. Entire plays were written in her image, only to be banned after audiences began mimicking her gestures, uncontrollably tilting their heads at strange angles, muttering to their own reflections, refusing food that wasn't soaked in brine. Her beauty became a plague, a performance that rewrote the body. Artists who painted her fell sick. Sculptors claimed their clay moved under their hands. Musicians heard her name woven into songs they didn't write, and still she spread. In dreams, in whispers, in the habits of women who'd never learned her story but began walking barefoot at dusk, rubbing salt onto their wrists, and listening to nothing for hours. Cleopatra had become something more dangerous than memory. She had become a behavior, not taught, not inherited, contagious. Her final rituals, those acts of rot, of secrecy, of transformation, had embedded themselves in the human pattern, and like all viruses of meaning, they waited to be seen again, felt again, imitated again, and they always were. The women who bled into rosewater and bathed in candle smoke, the men who traced spirals into their bedsheets before sleep, the children who drew suns with too many rays and too many eyes. Somewhere beneath it all, her shape curled in shadow, not alive, not dead, remembered, but differently, not as Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, but as the thing that made beauty feel dangerous, as the whisper that made ritual feel like revelation, as the breath that turned desire into dread. Her legacy did not demand temples. It needed only repetition, and humanity, trembling and curious, provided it. The centuries moved forward, but she did not retreat. Her name grew quieter, but her methods multiplied. Historians try to pin her legacy down, to extract it like a thorn from the skin of time, but each attempt only made the wound deeper. By the 2nd century, Cleopatra was no longer a person but a whisper passed between alchemists. Her image had been smuggled into scrolls, not as a queen, but as a figure surrounded by concentric circles. Her body stretched unnaturally, her eyes wide and blank, her fingers tipped with ink. They called her the vessel, the transformation, she who rewrote blood. In secret gatherings of early physicians, her recipes were repeated though distorted. Goat fat boiled with crushed pearls, vinegar distilled through bronze funnels into linen-wrapped jars, honey soaked in ashes and poured into the ears during eclipses. None of it healed, but some of it changed people, made them dream differently, made them sweat salt, made them forget names they had known all their lives. Apothecaries recorded strange side effects, women developing dual heartbeats, men who began weeping when exposed to saffron. A cult emerged briefly in Antioch, calling themselves the Reclaimed. They shaved their heads, darkened their eyes with ash, and walked barefoot over thorned cloth. Their only scripture was a fragmented text called the 13th Mirror, allegedly found beneath a collapsed bathhouse wall, inscribed on copper sheets. The text began with the line, "What she put on her skin, we must put on the world." Within 3 years, the entire sect had vanished. Some said they burned, others said they changed form. No one agreed, but the baths never felt warm again. Renaissance painters, obsessed with her visage, began embedding her face into unrelated portraits: Venus, Judith, even the Madonna, but always with something wrong. An extra pupil, a dark ring around the mouth, a bruise blooming beneath the ear. Viewers claimed these paintings hummed faintly. Some swore they smelled something sweet and sour at once, like spoiled fruit in sunlight. Libraries began losing records of her, not because they were destroyed, but because pages turned blank. Biographers complained that every time they began to write her name, their ink grew watery. They described dreams of her standing at their desks, silently unrolling scrolls with writing that wriggled like worms. Even in the Age of Reason, she defied containment. Enlightenment thinkers scoffed at her power, dismissing her as a symbol of ancient superstition. But when one such scholar dissected an embalmed cat from her rumored palace, he found a tiny scroll curled in its stomach. It read only, "Your mirror has lied to you. He stopped speaking afterward, spent the rest of his life carving spirals into ivory and burying them in clay pots. Perfume houses in France claimed to rediscover her formulas. They bottled scents with names like Black Honey, Salted Moon, Venin Royal. They sold well at first, but reports emerged of users experiencing hallucinations, tremors, and obsessive behavior. One heiress was found weeks later in a marble tub filled with brine, clutching a cracked hand mirror and whispering, "She showed me how to peel it off." When asked what it was, she simply smiled. Cleopatra had become a contagion of symbols, a repeating loop that infected wherever beauty, power, and decay intersected. Her rituals were no longer hers, they were everywhere. In fashion houses that pushed women to deform their waists, in surgical theaters that cut open faces to preserve youth, in cults that taught silence as the highest form of speech, in obsessions with glass skin, snake venom creams, and treatments involving leeches and light deprivation. Her fingerprints dusted the edges of every obsession that fused vanity with pain. And yet, no one could trace the line back to her directly. She was the phantom origin, the rot that smiled, the myth that dressed itself in silk and salt and vanished through locked doors. Scholars eventually stopped trying to categorize her. Theologians argued whether she had become a demon, a saint, or simply the first true celebrity. But they all agreed on one thing. She endured, not in bone, not in gold, but in repetition. Every time someone whispered, "This will make you beautiful," she stirred. Every time someone bled for youth, she blinked. Every time someone feared a mirror, she smiled. Cleopatra was no longer bound to a name. She was an instinct, a shadow coiled in the folds of luxury, a secret encoded in self-destruction. And those who felt her pull the stylists, the surgeons, the sorcerers, the seekers could not stop themselves. They burned rose petals and bone. They scalded skin and called it purity. They mistook the glow of infection for radiance. And all the while, she watched. Not from tomb or temple, but from the back of the mind, where the need to be seen and the fear of being seen meet. Where the mask is worn so long, it becomes the face. Where ritual becomes identity. She did not ask for worship. She demanded imitation. And the world, without knowing, obeyed. You can see her now in ring lights, in the glow of bathroom selfies at 2 a.m., in the hush that falls over someone just before they apply something they cannot pronounce. She's in the influencer whispering about ancient formulas while rubbing gold dust into their pores. She's in the spa that sells snake venom facials, promising skin like glass and silence like stone. Cleopatra is no longer myth. She's a business model, a brand, a biohazard in a velvet jar. Her rituals have been cleaned, packaged, rebranded. No more goat milk in urns, but now peptide serums in tinted glass bottles. No more beetles crushed in temple bowls, but now synthetic substitutes crafted to mimic the same acidic sting. No more bloodletting under moonlight, but now lasers that burn away time, skin, memory, and always the same promise: beauty, power, transformation. Just a little pain, just a little cost, just a little you erased. Scientists in white coats now do what her attendants once did in shadows. They peel, inject, extract. They measure cheekbones and symmetry. They use algorithms to predict desire. Cleopatra's reflection has been uploaded, filtered, fed through neural nets. AI reconstructs her probable voice. Marketing teams build campaigns around the idea of ancient elegance. And somewhere, a teenage girl stares at her phone, applies the suggested product, and tells herself she will finally be enough. The ghost of Cleopatra does not haunt ruins. She haunts routines. The morning mirror. The 27th selfie. The fingers trembling just before deleting a post that didn't get enough likes. Her influence no longer needs temples or scrolls. It exists in pop-ups, in sponsored content, in the rhythm of consumption that mimics ritual. Cleanse, apply, conceal, reveal. She taught the world that beauty could be a weapon. That transformation was proof of control. that the body was not a prison but a canvas, and rot, when curated, could be seductive. Her secrets were never meant to be shared, but we built platforms to shout them, and now we are drowning in them. Influencers whisper her name without knowing. Cosmetic surgeons channel her prayers with every incision. Aesthetic clinics build altars to her ghost, calling them treatment rooms, lit with soft blue light, where the sacrifice is subtle and the worship is monthly. And what of the outcomes? Not immortality, not even lasting beauty, just the endless chase, just the repetition, just the slight nausea that comes after too much honey, just the sting of vinegar beneath a smile. Cleopatra's rituals weren't disgusting because they used rot. They were disgusting because they promised transcendence and delivered dependence. And now, centuries later, we've perfected the formula. Skincare as sacrifice, beauty as currency, aging as failure, pain as purification. She would be proud, or horrified, or both. But she would understand. She would recognize the look in the eyes of those about to go under the knife, the hush before a needle breaks skin, the stillness in the breath before seeing oneself in a mirror that does not leave it, does not comfort either. Because beneath it all, the same hunger remains. To be seen, to be powerful, to be untouchable. Her legacy did not survive in pyramids or scrolls. It survived in the subtle tyranny of beauty, in the rituals we now call self-care, though they often feel like self-erasure, in the silence after compliments when we wonder if they're true, in the guilt after indulgence, in the ache after improvement. Cleopatra never left. She only changed outfits. And now she lives in the algorithms, in the before and after shots, in the whispered advice passed between friends late at night. Use this, they say. It worked for me. And somewhere, beneath centuries of dust and screens, she smiles again. Not with lips, but with absence. Not with presence, but with echo. A queen no longer of Nile and temple, but of filter and syringe. We did not dethrone her, we gave her more thrones. Pocket-sized ones, lit from beneath, cleansed daily, worshipped hourly, mirrors. There is a reason we still talk about her. Not because she was the most beautiful, not because she ruled or seduced or conquered, but because she saw something terrible in the mirror and did not look away. She leaned into it, learned its shape, learned its price, and paid it. Again and again. Now we inherit the echo of her choices, not with reverence, but with routine. We exfoliate, we inject, we starve and sculpt and shine, and we call it maintenance. We laugh at her fermented mare's milk, but smear acids onto our skin. We flinch at her bath in donkey blood, but coat ourselves in stem cell creams. We gasp at her pearl elixirs, but drink collagen dissolved in coffee. Her rituals repulse us until they don't, until they're reformulated, until they're offered in samples, until they're sold in sleek packaging, promising clarity and confidence. And somewhere, in the fluorescent hum of a drugstore aisle, someone reaches out and thinks just this one more thing, just this last touch, just until I look like myself again. But what self? Which mirror? Cleopatra's power was never just in her body, it was in her belief that the body could be rewritten, replaced, masked. Her genius was in ritual, not results, because results fade. But ritual? Ritual repeats. And now we repeat her. Daily. Silently. Willingly. W.E. Do not call it worship, but it has all the signs. We buy tools we do not understand. We repeat words without meaning hydration, lifting, barrier repair. We obey instructions as if from a priesthood layer this before that, never mix these two, cleanse only in the dark. And we wait. For change, for compliments, for something in the mirror to finally look like a promise kept. But Cleopatra knew. The mirror lies. Not with what it shows, but with what it demands. More. Always more. The line between care and punishment blurs, between elegance and erasure, between beauty and its opposite, which is not ugliness, but invisibility. Cleopatra's rituals were not disgusting because they involved rot. They were disgusting because they turned the body into a battlefield, because they made vanity a discipline, because they replaced peace with perfection. And now, centuries later, we continue the war, not on age, not on blemishes, but on softness, on acceptance, on stillness. We wear discomfort like a badge. We celebrate struggle. We romanticize glow achieved through pain. We have built an empire of creams and cuts and claims, and crowned ourselves its subjects. Cleopatra may have died by poison or snakebite or rumor, but her rituals never died. They metastasized into industries, into insecurities, into apps that show you what you'd look like, improved, into filters that smooth away expression, into voices that whisper only better is enough, only less is more, only change is safety. And so we submit, and smile, and spend, and forget the question that once mattered most, not how do I look, but why do I fear what I am? That question is buried beneath ads and aspirations, beneath history and highlighter, beneath centuries of forgetting what it means to live in a body without debt. But sometimes in the quiet, in the steam of a mirror after a long shower, in the softness of your own fingers touching your own face without judgment, in the breath before the ritual begins, you remember. You glimpse the possibility that you do not need to peel, or polish, or purify, that you are already sacred, not in spite of time, but because of it, that beauty is not an offering to be made, but a space to be occupied, quietly, fully, as you are. Cleopatra did not know this, could not know this. She was too afraid, too powerful, too alone. But we perhaps can choose differently, can see her not as a guide, but as a warning, a myth of magnificence rotting from within, a queen who believed the body was a mask and forgot the face beneath. Her legacy is not in her rituals, but in their repetition. And maybe it ends here, not with a scream, but with a sigh, with a stillness, with a hand resting gently on skin, saying, enough. You are not a project. You are not a throne. You are not a mirror. You are the moment the mirror fogs, the breath behind the reflection, the softness after the story ends. She would not recognize the world, and yet she would feel at home in it. The soft glass of phones, the ritual of swiping, the whisper of promises in beauty aisles. She would nod, faintly amused, at the precision of modern vanity serums timed to seconds, moisturizers with molecular weight claims, routines like prayers. She would smile at the obsession with glow, as if skin could be luminous without something dying beneath it. We have not moved on. We have evolved the same hunger. We trace her shape in our influencers, our apps, our fears. Not because we want to be her, but because we fear being forgotten. To age is to vanish. To blemish is to break code. To rest is to decay. So we don't rest. We tone, tighten, sculpt. We remake ourselves in better lighting, always chasing a softness that can't be pixelated. And in the chase, we lose some things, perhaps. Or joy. Or the quiet intimacy of looking in the mirror and simply saying, hello. Cleopatra never said hello to her reflection. She challenged it, defied it, dominated it, and now we inherit that posture. Not lovers of our own faces, but generals surveying a battlefield. The wrinkle must go, the shadow must lift, the volume must return. But when? And at what cost? Not the gold, not the coin, not even the time, but the silence. The space in which we used to breathe. Now filled with steps, with products, with calculations. The ancient filth was literal, but today it's spiritual. We scrub and cannot reach the root, because the root is not on the skin. It's in the myth, the one where beauty saves you, where transformation redeems you, where control equals love. That myth is older than Cleopatra, but she carved it into gold, etched it into coal, pressed it into honeyed paste and unguents that whispered, become more, always more, never just be. And now we live in that whisper. We pass it on without knowing, to daughters, to strangers, to ourselves each morning. Improve. it says. You're not far off. Just one more cream, one more tool, one more ritual. But rituals are not cumulative. They are loops, and in the loop, we forget what we were before the chase, what we could be after it ends. Cleopatra became legend not for her beauty, but for what her beauty cost. Empires, lives, herself. And we too pay. In money, yes, but also in stillness, in the meals skipped, in the nights spent spiraling, in the joy that dims when the photo doesn't capture what you hoped. This is the inheritance, not her throne, not her secrets, but her doubt. Transmitted like a virus, dressed like empowerment, sold like freedom. You are in control, it says, while handing you a script written by someone who profits from your uncertainty. And so you obey, smile, spend. Adjust your face to match the version others prefer. Until the mirror doesn't lead, simply stops meaning anything. Until the reflection is familiar, but not known. Until the rituals are done without thought, without pause. Until you forget they came from a woman who died trying to escape her own image, who believed power meant transformation, who thought pain could be permanence. But what if she was wrong? What if the secret is not in the pearl dust or the acids or the oils, but in the refusal? The refusal to chase, to shrink, to perform. The refusal to let a mirror become a god. She never learned that. But we might. In the moments we stop. In the breath, before we begin again. In the hand that hovers over a bottle, then decides to close the drawer. In the softness we allow. Not as surrender, but as rebellion. Cleopatra made herself in layers. But you are not sediment. You are not ash to be brushed away. You are here, breathing, soft, complete, and that is enough. That is always enough. She fades, not with drama, not with poison. But like all myths, dockwheely when no one is watching, Cleopatra, the woman, the queen, the architect of her own decay, slips beneath the tide of centuries and becomes sediment. The skin she tended with fermented things, the hair she anointed with oils from crushed petals, the rituals she swore by all dust now. Dust in museums, dust in books, dust in memory. And yet, we still carry her. Not as a statue or a story, but as a reflex. A whisper, a tension in the jaw when the light is bad. A pause before posting a photo. A hesitation at the sight of bare skin in the mirror. This is how legends linger not in glory, but in gesture. In the tiny, inherited cruelties we perform on ourselves without thought. Astringents, injections, contour, correct, cover, smile. As if presentation were protection. As if perfection were a promise. But what was the promise really? That beauty would save us? That control would grant peace? That if we performed the rituals well enough, we'd be loved, remembered, spared? Cleopatra believed it. Maybe we all do, in some form. But belief is not truth. And history, though it adores drama, often forgets tenderness. There is tenderness in saying no. No to the mask. No to the potion. No to the punishment disguised as polish. There is tenderness in saying yes, too. Yes to the crease. Yes to the dullness. Yes to the soft, slow bloom of age. To the strangeness of the body in its natural rhythm. To the beauty that does not ask for payment. Cleopatra never reached that yes. She lived in mirrors, died by myth, and left behind a blueprint that still traps us, but it does not have to. We can trace her path to its edge, and stop, and rest, and reclaim what she could not piece. The peace of being without striving. The peace of not being seen and being okay. The peace of skin untouched by war. It does not sell, it does not sparkle. It does not trend, but it soothes, and it stays. You are not a ritual. You are not a refinement. You are not a relic to be restored. You are a presence, a pulse, a moment, and you do not need to become anything more than that. Let the creams expire. Let the whispers go quiet. Let the mirror fog. And in that blur, in that soft erasure of lines and fears, may you finally meet yourself. Not the self-curated or corrected, but the one that breathes without needing to impress. The one that smiles for no reason, the one that still remembers how to sleep. Not from exhaustion, but from ease. That is where she could not follow. That is where you are free. Sleep now. The myths are finished. The mirrors are covered. The jars are sealed. You are home.